Sarah Mitchell pulled the thin cardboard closer around her shoulders as the October wind cut through the alleyway behind Mercy General Hospital. 3 months of sleeping rough had taught her that the loading dock offered the best shelter from both the elements and the security guards who made their rounds every 2 hours like clockwork. Her stomach cramped with hunger. But the day-old sandwich she'd managed to salvage from the dumpster would have to wait until morning. Eating in the dark was dangerous when you couldn't see what had begun to grow on the bread. The inheritance letter had been forwarded through 3 different homeless shelters before finally reaching her at the temporary women's facility on 5th Street. Sarah had stared at the legal letterhead for a full minute, certain it was some cruel joke or elaborate scam. Great-aunt Millicent Hayes, a woman Sarah barely remembered from childhood family gatherings, had died at 93 and somehow, impossibly, left her the Starlight Motel. Sarah remembered Millicent only as a quiet woman who sat in corners at family reunions, speaking softly with Sarah's grandmother and nodding politely when relatives made conversation. She had seemed ancient, even when Sarah was a child, her silver hair always pulled back in the same neat bun, her clothes simple but elegant in a way that suggested they had been expensive once upon a time. The family had whispered about Millicent's choices: never marrying, living alone in the desert, running what everyone assumed was a failing business on a forgotten highway, eccentric. Sarah's mother had always said, with a particular tone reserved for family members whose life choices were considered unfortunate. She could have lived anywhere after she sold her father's hardware store, but she chose to waste her life in the middle of nowhere. Now, crouched in the shadow of a dumpster with the inheritance papers clutched in her wind-chapped hands, Sarah wondered if Millicent's choice had been as foolish as everyone believed, or if perhaps she had understood something about the value of forgotten places that the rest of the family had missed. Condemned property, the lawyer had explained over the phone, his voice carefully neutral. The city's been trying to demolish it for years, but your aunt fought them in court. Now it's your problem, Miss Mitchell. I should warn you, the back taxes alone amount to nearly $40,000. There's also the matter of environmental cleanup. The old underground fuel tanks haven't been properly decommissioned, and the county is requiring soil remediation before any demolition can proceed. Sarah had actually laughed at the absurdity of it. A homeless woman inheriting a condemned motel was like being given a broken umbrella in a hurricane. But desperation had its own logic, and when the winter weather forecast promised the coldest October in decades, even a crumbling roof seemed better than the open sky. The bus journey to the Starlight Motel took 4 transfers and most of a day. Sarah dozed fitfully against the window, watching suburban sprawl give way to agricultural land, then to increasingly empty desert, punctuated by ghost towns and abandoned gas stations. Each mile took her further from the city's services, the soup kitchens, the day labor pickup spots, the libraries, where she could use computers and clean bathrooms, but also away from the constant vigilance that urban homelessness required. The Starlight Motel sat on a forgotten stretch of what had once been Route 66, now bypassed by the interstate, and left to decay alongside other relics of America's automotive golden age. Sarah approached the property on foot from the highway off-ramp, her few possessions, a backpack, a sleeping bag, and a plastic bag containing her important documents, weighing heavy on her shoulders despite their meager contents. The motel's pink neon sign hung dark and broken against the desert sky, letters missing like teeth in a fighter's smile. What remained spelled Street Lie, H.T. Mo-E, and even in its decay, Sarah could imagine how it must have looked in its heyday, blazing rose-colored light calling to travelers who still believed that the journey was as important as the destination. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt parking lot, creating abstract patterns that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Every window she could see was either boarded up or broken, and some of the room doors hung askew on rusted hinges. A swimming pool in the center courtyard had been drained and filled with debris, its blue-painted bottom now a canvas for graffiti tags and windblown trash. The office building at the property's entrance had lost some of its roof tiles, and a chain-link fence surrounded the entire complex with signs warning against trespassing. But there were also details that suggested the property hadn't been entirely abandoned until recently. Someone had maintained the native landscaping around the office building, desert willows and sage plants that required minimal water but careful pruning to thrive. A small garden area beside what appeared to be a larger unit at the far end of the horseshoe-shaped complex showed evidence of recent cultivation, though the plants now struggled without regular watering. The key the lawyer had given her was old brass, worn smooth by decades of use. Sarah tried it in the office door first, surprised when it turned easily in the lock. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty courtyard like a ghost's welcome, and she stepped into a space frozen in time. Inside, dust particles danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that filtered through holes in the boarded windows. The registration desk was still there, its wood veneer peeling and warped from years of desert temperature extremes, but behind it hung a board with room keys dangling from numbered hooks. Most were present, their plastic key tags faded from bright colors to pale pastels, but the numbers were still legible. An old cash register sat on the desk beside a guest registry book, its pages yellow and brittle with age. Sarah opened the registry to the last entries and found dates from just 2 years earlier. Not paying customers, but what appeared to be inspection visits from city officials and maintenance workers. The handwriting was the same throughout those final entries, a careful script that signed each page as M. Hayes, owner. Millicent had been here, maintaining some minimal presence at the property until very near the end of her life. Room 9's key was missing from its hook. Sarah spent her first night in the motel office, curled up in her sleeping bag behind the counter on a carpet that had once been deep burgundy, but now showed decades of foot traffic and stains. It wasn't warm. The desert's October nights carried a chill that crept through the broken windows and gaps in the walls. But it was dry, and for the first time in months, she wasn't constantly alert for the sounds of approaching footsteps or the beam of a flashlight seeking her out. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. No traffic sounds, no sirens, no voices from neighboring camps or shelters. Just the occasional whisper of wind through the building's openings and, once, the distant howl of coyotes that made her grateful for the locked door between her and the desert night. Morning brought the sound of rain against the windows, a gentle precipitation that was both blessing and curse in this landscape. Welcome moisture, but also evidence that the building's roof was no longer entirely sound. Sarah could hear water dripping in several locations throughout the office, and when she ventured outside, she discovered that some of the motel room doors stood slightly ajar, revealing interiors that had clearly suffered from weather exposure. She realized she faced the same choice that had confronted her great-aunt Millicent for years. Surrender the property to the city for demolition, accepting whatever minimal compensation might be offered after all debts and cleanup costs, or find some way to pay the mounting obligations that came with ownership. The lawyer had been clear about the timeline: 6 months to bring the taxes current and address the environmental issues, or face foreclosure. But there was a third option, one that emerged as Sarah began her systematic exploration of the property. She could live here, at least temporarily, while she figured out her next steps. The city's condemnation order prohibited commercial operation, but it didn't specifically forbid the owner from occupying the property. For someone who had been sleeping in alleys and doorways, even a condemned motel room offered luxury she hadn't experienced in months. She began her exploration methodically, starting with the rooms closest to the office. Room 1 still contained its original furniture: 2 double beds with sagging mattresses, a small table and 2 chairs, a dresser with a mirror so spotted with age that reflections appeared ghostly and incomplete. Decades of desert dust coated every surface, but underneath the neglect, Sarah could see evidence of the care that had once gone into the property's maintenance. The bathroom fixtures were vintage but substantial, heavy porcelain that had been built to last. The shower stall was small but functional, though Sarah quickly discovered that the water had been shut off at some point. Room 2 was similar in layout but had suffered more weather damage, with a section of ceiling that had collapsed and allowed rain to warp the flooring and encourage mold growth on the walls. Room 3 had a hole in its roof where a tree branch had fallen during some long-ago storm, and pigeons had taken up residence in the wreckage. Their constant cooing and the rustling of their movements created an odd domesticity in the ruins, as if nature was slowly reclaiming the human-made spaces. Room 4's door was locked, but Sarah could see through a broken window that it had become home to transients before the property was officially condemned: sleeping bags and cardboard, empty bottles and food containers. The detritus of people who, like her, had needed shelter and found it in forgotten places. Rooms 5 and 6 were largely intact but showed evidence of vandalism: graffiti on the walls, broken fixtures, mirrors that had been shattered deliberately rather than damaged by weather. Someone had used Room 7's walls as a canvas for elaborate spray-painted murals depicting desert scenes and abstract designs that weren't without artistic merit, though Sarah doubted the artist had had permission. Room 8 stood at the far end of the motel's horseshoe configuration, and unlike the others, its windows were not just boarded up, but had been covered with what appeared to be more substantial barriers: plywood that had been painted to match the building's exterior, creating the illusion that the windows were simply dark rather than blocked. It was the layout of the motel that gradually revealed the reason for Room 9's missing key. The rooms were arranged in a horseshoe shape around the central courtyard with its empty pool, but Room 9 was positioned differently from the others. Where Rooms 1 through 8 were standard motel units with doors facing the courtyard, Room 9 appeared to be a larger structure that wrapped around the far end of the horseshoe. It had what appeared to be an additional wing or extension that stretched back from the main building line, creating a more substantial footprint than any of the other units. Sarah found herself putting off her approach to Room 9, though she couldn't articulate why. There was something about its position at the far end of the complex, the way its main door faced the courtyard while additional windows looked out toward the desert, that made her hesitate. When she finally walked the cracked concrete path to its blue-painted door, she noticed that while every other room showed signs of forced entry or vandalism, Room 9's door remained securely locked, its paint faded but unbroken, its windows intact behind their painted plywood barriers. The brass key from the office didn't fit the lock. Sarah tried it twice, then examined the mechanism more closely. This was newer hardware, probably installed within the last decade, while all the other room locks were original to the motel's 1960s construction. The deadbolt was substantial, suggesting that whatever lay behind the door was considered worth protecting. She walked around the building's exterior, looking for another way in, and discovered that the additional structure she'd noticed was actually a substantial addition. Not just a storage room, but what appeared to be a complete secondary living space. Windows on this side of the building looked out over a small, private courtyard that was hidden from the main motel area, and unlike the public-facing windows, these were not boarded up, but covered with what appeared to be normal interior curtains. Behind Room 9, accessible only through a side door that faced the desert rather than the courtyard, was the small garden Sarah had noticed from the highway. Up close, she could see that someone had invested considerable effort in its creation and maintenance. Desert wildflowers grew in neat rows, their blooms providing splashes of yellow and purple against the brown earth. A trellis supported the dried remains of what had been climbing roses, and though the plants were suffering from lack of water, they weren't dead. A wind chime hung from the eaves above the garden, its soft melody the first pleasant sound Sarah had heard on the property. Someone had placed smooth river stones in patterns around the flower beds, creating pathways and borders that transformed what could have been a simple patch of desert into something approaching a sanctuary. The side door was unlocked. Sarah pushed it open cautiously, calling out, "Hello?" Her voice seemed to disappear into the space beyond, absorbed by what felt like the acoustic dampening of a lived-in space rather than the hollow echo she'd grown accustomed to in the abandoned rooms. She stepped across the threshold and immediately understood why Room 9's key was missing from the office board. This wasn't another abandoned motel room. This was where someone had lived, recently and fully. Sunlight fell through clean windows onto hardwood floors that were dusty from disuse but well-maintained underneath the surface grime. The main room contained a kitchen area with appliances that, while dated, were in working order. A refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner, a gas stove with burners that sparked when Sarah experimentally turned a knob, cabinets stocked with dishes and cooking supplies. A small dining table sat near windows that looked out over the private garden, and Sarah could imagine someone taking their meals there while watching the desert wildlife that she now noticed strategically placed among the plantings. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes ranging from art books and biographies to works on desert ecology and southwestern history. The book showed the wear of frequent handling, with bookmarks and margin notes that spoke of a serious reader who engaged deeply with her chosen texts. On the mantel above a stone fireplace sat framed photographs, and Sarah approached them with growing amazement. The photos showed her great-aunt Millicent, but not the elderly woman Sarah vaguely remembered from family gatherings. These images captured decades of life. Millicent as a young woman standing beside the Starlight Motel's original neon sign when it was new and blazing with light, her blonde hair styled in 1960s waves, her smile bright with the confidence of someone embarking on a great adventure. In another photo, Millicent stood with a man Sarah didn't recognize, both of them laughing beside a classic convertible in the motel's parking lot. The man was handsome in the way of old movie stars, and his arm around Millicent's waist suggested an intimacy that made Sarah realize how little she knew about her great-aunt's private life. Other photos showed Millicent, at different ages, hosting what appeared to be parties in the motel's courtyard. Working in the garden Sarah had discovered outside, standing beside what were clearly art installations or exhibitions. But it was the wall adjacent to the photographs that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Covering the entire surface were paintings, dozens of them, ranging from small canvases no larger than a sheet of paper to works that dominated significant portions of the wall space. They weren't amateur efforts or hobby paintings created to fill empty hours. Even to Sarah's untrained eye, these works possessed a sophistication and emotional depth that spoke of serious artistic talent and years of dedicated practice. The paintings depicted scenes of desert life, but not the romanticized sunsets and cactus landscapes that filled tourist shops along the remaining stretches of Route 66. These were intimate portraits of the people who made their lives in forgotten places. Migrant workers resting in the shade of their trucks during the brutal heat of midday, their faces weathered but dignified. Elderly Native Americans at a roadside trading post, surrounded by jewelry and pottery that represented generations of cultural knowledge. Children playing in the dust outside a trailer park, their joy transcending the poverty of their circumstances. Each face was rendered with such care and attention that Sarah felt she could step into their worlds, could understand something of their stories and struggles. The brushwork showed technical mastery, but more than that, it revealed a deep empathy for the subjects. These weren't paintings of the poor or marginalized created from a distance by someone studying them as curiosities. These were portraits painted by someone who saw her subjects as fully human, who understood that dignity could exist anywhere and that everyone's story mattered. In the corner of every painting, in small but clear letters, was the signature, M. Hayes. Great-Aunt Millicent had been an artist, and not just any artist. She had been an artist of considerable talent who had spent decades documenting the lives of people society usually overlooked. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon exploring what had clearly been Millicent's private living space, separate from the motel operations. A small bedroom contained an easel with an unfinished painting still stretched on its frame, a portrait of the motel itself, but rendered as it must have looked in its heyday, with cars parked in front of rooms and figures visible through lighted windows. The painting captured not just the physical details of the property, but something of the hope and possibility that travelers must have felt when they saw the Starlight's neon beacon promising rest and comfort at the end of a long day's drive. Art supplies were organized in careful rows on a table beside the easel. Tubes of paint arranged by color from warm to cool, brushes of various sizes clean and ready for use, palettes with dried paint that showed evidence of recent work. A magnifying glass and small detail brushes suggested that Millicent had continued working on fine details even as her eyesight aged, determined to maintain the quality of her work, regardless of physical limitations. But it was when Sarah opened a small roll-top desk in the corner that she began to understand the true scope of what she had inherited. Inside were folders containing correspondence with art galleries, museum curators, and private collectors. The letters went back decades, and as Sarah read through them, a story emerged that made her sink into the desk chair in growing amazement. Millicent Hayes had not been running a failing motel on a forgotten highway while creating art as a hobby. She had been living as a recluse while building a reputation in the art world that had slowly, quietly grown into something substantial. Gallery owners in Santa Fe and Los Angeles wrote requesting exhibitions of her work. Museums in Phoenix and Denver inquired about acquisitions for their permanent collections. Private collectors offered substantial sums for individual pieces, and some of the correspondence suggested that Millicent's paintings were being sold for prices that would have supported her comfortably, even without the motel's income. A letter from the curator of contemporary American art at a major museum in California, dated just 2 years earlier, expressed enthusiasm for a planned retrospective of Millicent's work. "Your documentation of Invisible America," the curator wrote, "represents some of the most important social realist painting being done today. We believe a major exhibition of your desert period paintings would establish your work in the canon of essential American art of the late 20th and early 21st centuries." Millicent's response, carbon copied and filed behind the original letter, was polite but firm in its refusal. "I am not ready to step out of the shadows. My work continues here, and I believe my subjects are better served by my presence than by my fame. Perhaps someday the time will be right for broader recognition, but that day has not yet come." Sarah found similar exchanges with other institutions, all following the same pattern: recognition and opportunity offered, politely but firmly declined. It appeared that Millicent had been content to sell individual pieces to support herself while maintaining her privacy and continuing her work documenting the lives of people who passed through or lived in the forgotten corners of the American Southwest. And at the bottom of the desk's largest drawer, Sarah found a manila envelope marked Estate Instructions in Millicent's careful handwriting. Inside was a handwritten letter dated just 3 months earlier, suggesting that Millicent had known her death was approaching. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have inherited more than you know. I chose you not because we were close. Indeed, I regret that we were not, but because of all our family members. You alone showed kindness to those who had nothing. I remember the Christmas when you were 12, how you gave your new coat to the homeless man outside the church while your parents weren't looking. That coat cost more than my electric bill. But you saw someone cold and acted without thinking of the cost to yourself. I have lived in this place for 43 years, not because I couldn't leave, but because I found something here worth staying for. The interstate bypassed us in 1978, and most businesses moved closer to the new highway. The Starlight could have closed then, probably should have, from a purely financial perspective. But I discovered that the people who still traveled the old roads, who stopped at forgotten places like my motel, carried stories that the world needed to see. Some were migrants following work seasons, carrying their lives in pickup trucks, and hoping for fair wages and decent treatment. Some were Native Americans traveling between reservations, maintaining family connections across hundreds of desert miles. Some were simply people who had been forgotten by economic changes, who couldn't afford the chain hotels near the interstate, but still needed places to rest during their journeys between one uncertain situation and another. I began painting their portraits, at first just for my own satisfaction, later because I realized that someone needed to document the dignity and humanity of people society was learning to overlook. The art world discovered my work through galleries in Santa Fe, but I chose to remain here because this is where the stories were, where the faces that needed painting would continue to appear. I hope you will understand that what I am leaving you is not a burden, but a treasure that comes with responsibility. The paintings in this room represent a lifetime of work, but they are not the extent of my collection. Over the years, I have been careful to preserve the most significant pieces in a climate-controlled environment. In the motel office, behind the registration desk, you will find a panel on the wall that opens with the brass key you used to enter the building. What you find there will give you choices I never had. The motel itself is condemned, and probably beyond saving, but the land has value, and my paintings have more value than you might expect. I have been approached by museums and collectors offering substantial sums, but I was never ready to let go of my life's work. Now that choice passes to you. Use this gift wisely, my dear. The world has been hard to you, I know. Our family's whispers and letters have kept me informed of your struggles, even though we maintained little direct contact. But you have not allowed hardship to make you hard in return. That Christmas coat told me everything I needed to know about your character, and that is why I trust you with what I could not trust to anyone else in our family. There is enough here to ensure that you need never be homeless or hungry again, but I hope you will see beyond the financial security to the deeper inheritance I am offering. These paintings exist because I learned to see the humanity in forgotten people and forgotten places. Perhaps you, having experienced being forgotten yourself, will understand what I was trying to accomplish and find a way to continue that work. With love and faith in your good heart, Aunt Millicent. Sarah read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated her consciousness. Then, clutching the brass key, she left Millicent's living space and walked through the gathering darkness back to the motel office, her mind reeling with possibilities she was afraid to fully acknowledge. Behind the registration desk, her fingers traced the wood paneling until she found what felt like a seam running vertically along one section of the wall. The brass key fit into a nearly invisible lock, and when she turned it, a section of the wall swung inward like a door, revealing darkness beyond. Sarah felt along the inner wall until she found a light switch, and when she flipped it, track lighting came on automatically, illuminating a space that had clearly been added to the building's original structure years after its construction. The room was larger than she had expected, perhaps 15 by 20 feet, with walls lined with climate control equipment that hummed quietly in the background. The air inside was cool and dry, carefully maintained at museum-quality conditions, but it was what the climate control was protecting that made Sarah gasp aloud and reach out to steady herself against the doorframe. The walls were lined with paintings, but these were different from the works in Millicent's living space. These were larger, more complex compositions, and they were all professionally framed, titled, and dated. Sarah moved from piece to piece in growing amazement, beginning to understand the scope of what her great-aunt had accomplished over 4 decades of work. Here was the artistic development of a master, from Millicent's early, more traditional landscapes to increasingly sophisticated portraits and social commentary. The early works, dated in the 1960s and 1970s, showed technical competence but relatively conventional approaches to desert scenery and tourist imagery. But, as the years progressed, the paintings showed an artist finding her true voice and subject matter. By the 1980s, Millicent's focus had shifted to the people rather than just the landscape. Paintings from this period showed migrant families, truckers, traveling salesmen, and others whose work required constant movement through the emptying spaces of the rural Southwest. The faces were increasingly individualized, showing Millicent's growing skill at capturing not just physical likeness, but personality and inner life. The 1990s brought works that showed greater confidence and artistic ambition. Larger canvases allowed for more complex compositions that included multiple figures and detailed backgrounds that told stories about economic change and social displacement. A painting dated 1994 showed a family loading their possessions into a pickup truck outside a foreclosed farm, their faces showing determination despite their obvious losses. The details were so precise that Sarah could read the expression in a child's eyes, the particular way the father held his shoulders, the protective gesture of the mother's hand on her daughter's back. But it was the far wall that contained the works that made Sarah understand why Millicent had lived in secrecy and why major museums had been seeking her paintings. These paintings were not just artistic achievements. They were historical documents created by someone with unprecedented access to communities that usually remained invisible to mainstream society. Here was a series depicting migrant worker camps from the 1970s, rendered with unflinching honesty but also deep compassion. Sarah could see the poverty and difficult conditions, but she could also see the strength and dignity of people making lives under circumstances that would have defeated those with fewer resources of character and community support. Another series focused on Native American families during the casino development boom of the 1980s and 1990s. These paintings captured the complex emotions surrounding economic opportunities that came with cultural costs, showing individuals and families navigating between tradition and modernity with grace and difficulty in equal measure. A third group of paintings documented the gradual emptying of small desert towns as economic opportunities moved elsewhere. But rather than focusing on abandonment and decay, Millicent had painted the people who chose to stay. who maintained community and meaning in places the larger world had written off as failed. On a small table in the center of the room sat a folder marked Appraisals and Authentication. Inside, Sarah found documents from major auction houses and art authentication services. The most recent appraisal, completed just 6 months before Millicent's death by a firm that specialized in contemporary American art, valued the collection at between $12 and $15 million. Sarah sank into the single chair in the room, the appraisal documents fluttering to the floor around her feet. She was not homeless. She was not destitute. She was the inheritor of one of the most significant collections of contemporary American social realist art in private hands, created by an artist whose work had been quietly gaining recognition in the art world for decades. The next morning, Sarah called the lawyer from the phone in Millicent's living space. Apparently, her great-aunt had maintained phone and basic utility service even while allowing the motel itself to decay around her private sanctuary. "Mr. Peterson," she said when he answered, "this is Sarah Mitchell, about the motel inheritance. I think we need to talk. Miss Mitchell, I hope you understand that the property's condition makes it essentially worthless. The demolition costs alone would exceed any potential sale value, and the environmental cleanup requirements will be substantial. I've been in contact with the city about options for transferring the property to municipal ownership in exchange for forgiveness of the tax debt." "The motel itself might be worthless," Sarah said, looking out at the garden where morning light was catching the last blooms of Millicent's roses. "But what's inside it is worth $15 million. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah thought they'd been disconnected. Finally, Peterson spoke, his voice careful and professional in a way that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. "Miss Mitchell, I think you're right. We do need to talk. Can you be in my office tomorrow morning?" Sarah spent that evening reading through more of Millicent's correspondence, beginning to piece together a clearer picture of her great-aunt's life and work. Letters from the 1960s showed a young woman full of optimism about her new business venture, writing to family members about her plans for the Starlight Motel and her excitement about life in the desert Southwest. But by the 1970s, the tone had changed. Business correspondence indicated declining occupancy rates as the interstate system drew travelers away from the old highways. Insurance companies raised rates or canceled policies altogether for motels in increasingly isolated locations. It was during this period, according to letters Millicent had written to a college friend, that she had begun painting seriously. "The motel guests are fewer now," she wrote in 1975, "but the people who still stop here have such interesting stories. I've started sketching them when they're not looking, trying to capture something of their experiences. It's probably foolish, but I feel like someone should be recording the lives of people who are being left behind by all these changes." By the 1980s, Millicent's letters indicated that her art had begun selling, first at local galleries and arts and crafts fairs, later through dealers who specialized in Southwestern and contemporary American art. The income from painting sales allowed her to keep the motel operating even as traditional lodging revenue declined. More importantly, it gave her the freedom to be selective about her guests, often providing free accommodation to travelers who couldn't afford the rates. A journal entry from 1987 revealed Millicent's philosophy. "Mrs. Rodriguez stayed 3 days this week while her truck was being repaired. She's following the fruit harvest from California to Washington, traveling with her 2 youngest children, and sending money home to Mexico. She tried to pay me for the room, but I know she needs that money for gas and food. Instead, I asked if I could paint her portrait. She was shy at first, but when I showed her some of my other paintings, she said she was honored to be included with such dignified people. That's what I'm trying to do. Show that dignity exists everywhere, in every face, if you know how to look." Sarah found correspondence with art critics and scholars who had begun to take notice of Millicent's work by the 1990s. A professor of American Studies at a state university had written, requesting permission to include several of Millicent's paintings in a book about art and social change in the post-war Southwest. "Your work documents a crucial period of transition in American society," the professor wrote, "capturing the human cost of economic and social changes, with a degree of intimacy and insight that professional journalists and sociologists often miss." Millicent's response revealed both her commitment to her work and her reluctance to seek broader recognition. "I am honored by your interest," but I must ask you to understand that my first responsibility is to the people who trust me with their stories. If my paintings can contribute to broader understanding of their experiences, I am pleased, but I will not compromise their privacy or dignity for the sake of academic analysis or artistic recognition. The transformation of Sarah's circumstances required nearly 3 months to complete, but unlike the previous 3 months of her life, this period passed with the security of knowing that each day brought her closer to stability rather than further from it. Peterson, it turned out, had been Millicent's lawyer for over 20 years, and while he'd known about the art collection, he'd been bound by her instructions not to reveal its existence until after her death, and only to her chosen heir. Your great-aunt was very specific about her conditions, he explained during their first meeting in his downtown office. Sarah had borrowed clothes from Millicent's closet for the occasion, a simple but well-tailored dress that was decades out of style, but fit her perfectly and suggested an elegance she hadn't known she possessed. She wanted to ensure that whoever inherited her work would understand its value beyond the monetary. She was afraid the family would simply sell everything to the highest bidder, without understanding what she'd spent her life creating. The authentication and sale process required expertise that Sarah didn't possess, but Millicent had thought of that too. Among her papers were recommendations for art consultants, contacts at auction houses, and even suggestions for how to structure any sales to minimize tax implications while maximizing the long-term impact of her work. It became clear that her great-aunt had spent years preparing for this transition, wanting to ensure that her life's work would continue to have meaning and influence after her death. Sarah made the decision to sell a portion of the collection immediately, enough to pay the property taxes, fund basic restoration of the motel buildings, and provide herself with living expenses, while she decided what to do with the remainder of the paintings. But as she spent more time in Millicent's living space, surrounded by the artwork and the extensive documentation of her great-aunt's philosophy and methods, she began to understand what Millicent had meant about responsibility. These paintings weren't just valuable objects that could be converted to financial security. They were testimonies to lives that had been lived largely invisible to the broader world. The migrant workers, the Native American families, the small-town residents, the travelers and drifters who had passed through the Starlight Motel. Millicent had seen them, really seen them, and preserved their dignity and humanity in pigment and canvas. Simply selling the paintings to private collectors or even to museums wouldn't fully honor what Millicent had created. Sarah began to research art foundations, educational institutions, and cultural organizations that specialized in work addressing social justice and underrepresented communities. She reached out to universities with American Studies programs, to documentary filmmakers who focused on marginalized populations, to community organizations serving the kinds of people Millicent had painted. Slowly, a plan began to form that went beyond simply liquidating her inheritance for personal benefit. The Starlight Motel would be restored, but not as a commercial lodging property. It would become the Millicent Hayes Center for Documentary Arts, a retreat and educational facility where artists, writers, photographers, and filmmakers could come to work on projects that focused on overlooked communities and underrepresented voices. The motel rooms would be converted to studio spaces and simple accommodations for visiting artists. Millicent's collection would be displayed in a gallery built where the old pool had been, creating a permanent exhibition that would educate visitors about both the artistic techniques and social vision that had guided her work. Sarah moved permanently into Millicent's living space, but she didn't live there alone for long. As word of the project spread through art communities and social justice organizations, people began to reach out with requests to visit or collaborate. A documentary photographer named Marcus Williams, who had spent years capturing life in urban food deserts, wrote asking if he could spend a month working on a new project about rural poverty in the Southwest. His letter included samples of his work, portraits that showed the same empathy and technical skill that characterized Millicent's paintings, translated to the medium of black and white photography. Carmen Delgado, a muralist from Los Angeles, had heard about the center through gallery connections and wanted to create a large-scale work about the experiences of undocumented immigrants crossing the desert. Her proposal included plans for a mural that would cover one entire wall of the restored motel courtyard, visible to visitors, but also serving as a landmark for travelers on the old highway who might need to understand that they were welcome at the Starlight, regardless of their legal status. Dr. Jennifer Runningbear, a sculptor and professor of Native American Studies, requested residency time to work on an installation piece using materials salvaged from demolished reservation buildings. Her work explored themes of forced relocation and cultural preservation, and she believed that the desert setting and Millicent's legacy of documenting Indigenous experiences made the center an ideal location for her project. By the following spring, the Starlight Motel was alive again, but with a purpose that honored its past while creating something entirely new. The restoration had been carefully planned to preserve the property's 1960s character while adding modern amenities necessary for its function as an art center. The original pink neon sign had been restored and now blazed against the desert sky each evening, but instead of advertising vacancy rates, it welcomed visitors to the Millicent Hayes Center for Documentary Arts. Artists worked in the converted rooms during the day, each space equipped with proper lighting, climate control, and the specific infrastructure needed for different artistic media. Room 1 had become a photography darkroom and digital processing studio. Room 2 housed printmaking equipment for artists working in lithography and screen printing. Room 3 was configured as a painting studio, with north-facing windows and adjustable easels. Other rooms provided space for sculpture, mixed media work, writing, and film editing. In the evenings, the artist gathered in the restored courtyard, where the old pool had been replaced with an outdoor amphitheater and gallery space. Meals were shared community style, with conversations that ranged from technical discussions about artistic techniques to deeper explorations of how creative work could address social injustice and give voice to marginalized communities. Sarah found herself naturally assuming the role of program director and curator, drawing on skills she hadn't known she possessed, but which seemed to emerge from her combination of lived experience with homelessness and poverty, her growing understanding of Millicent's artistic vision, and her genuine interest in supporting other artists' work. She wasn't an artist herself, but she had developed an eye for recognizing authentic work that addressed social issues with both artistic merit and genuine empathy for its subjects. The local community's response to the center's establishment was initially mixed, but gradually shifted toward acceptance and even pride. Some longtime residents had viewed the condemned motel as an eyesore and were pleased to see it restored to functional use. Others were suspicious of the artists and their projects, concerned that outsiders might exploit or misrepresent local communities and their work. Sarah addressed these concerns by establishing community advisory relationships with local organizations and individuals. Roberto Martinez, who ran the small grocery store in the nearest town, became an informal liaison who helped visiting artists understand local customs and sensitivities. Elena Yazzie, a Navajo weaver and community elder, provided guidance for artists working on projects related to Native American experiences, ensuring that cultural protocols were respected and that Indigenous voices were centered in any work that addressed their communities. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the transformation, and Sarah was surprised to discover how many people in the surrounding area remembered both the motel in its heyday and Millicent herself. Roberto told Sarah that Millicent had painted his portrait in the 1980s, when he was still working in the fields and stopping at the motel's vending machines for cold drinks during his lunch breaks. She asked if she could paint me, he said, standing in the gallery where his portrait now hung as part of the permanent collection. I thought she was crazy. Who wants to paint an old farm worker? But she said everyone's story matters, and she wanted to make sure mine wasn't forgotten. She gave me a small sketch when she finished the big painting, and my wife framed it. It hangs in our kitchen now. Other community members came forward with similar memories, and, in some cases, small paintings or sketches that Millicent had given them over the years. Sarah realized that her great-aunt had been quietly building relationships and documenting community life for decades, creating an informal archive of local history through her artistic practice. Mrs. Rose Thompson, an elderly African-American woman whose family had moved to the area in the 1970s seeking agricultural work, brought a small canvas that showed her as a young mother with her 3 children. Miss Hayes painted this when my husband was in the hospital, she explained. Money was tight, and she let us stay in the motel for free while he recovered. She said the painting was payment for letting her practice her art, but I always knew she was just being kind. These personal connections helped Sarah understand that the center's mission couldn't be limited to providing studio space for visiting artists. It needed to serve the local community as well, honoring the relationships Millicent had built and ensuring that residents weren't simply subjects for artistic documentation, but partners in the creative process. Sarah established a community oral history project, working with local schools and senior centers to record the stories and memories of longtime residents. These recordings became source material for artists, projects, but they were also archived and made available to researchers and community members interested in preserving local history. A youth arts program brought teenagers from surrounding towns to the center during summer months, providing them with exposure to professional artistic techniques and opportunities to work with visiting artists on collaborative projects. Sarah was particularly moved by the work of Maria Santos, a 16-year-old from a migrant worker family whose mixed media pieces addressed the experience of constant movement and the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to new environments. "My family follows the crops," Maria explained during a presentation of youth program work. "We've lived in maybe 20 different places since I was born. But working here, learning about Miss Hayes's art, I realized that moving around doesn't mean you don't have a story worth telling. Maybe my story is about all those different places and the people we meet along the way." The success of the center's community engagement efforts attracted attention from educational institutions and cultural organizations throughout the Southwest. The University of Arizona's American Studies Department established a partnership that brought graduate students to conduct research using the center's archives and collections. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian expressed interest in a traveling exhibition of Millicent's paintings that focused on indigenous experiences. But it was the visit from Dr. Patricia Williams, a scholar of contemporary American art from Yale University, that helped Sarah understand the broader significance of what she was maintaining and developing. "Your great-aunt's work represents something unique in American art of the late 20th century," Dr. Williams explained during her week-long residency at the center. Most social realist artists of this period were based in major cities, documenting urban poverty and industrial change. Millicent was virtually alone in her sustained focus on rural and small-town experiences, particularly in the Southwest. Her work fills crucial gaps in the artistic record of American social and economic transformation. Dr. Williams had come to research Millicent's paintings for a book about artists who documented the effects of deindustrialization and economic restructuring on American communities. Her preliminary research suggested that Millicent's work was more historically significant than even the recent appraisals had recognized. "The art market tends to value work based on gallery representation and auction results," Dr. Williams continued. "But scholarly appreciation can take longer to develop and often proves more lasting. I believe your great-aunt's paintings will be recognized as essential documents of late 20th century American life, comparable to the work of Walker Evans or Dorothea Lange in their documentation of earlier periods of social change." This conversation prompted Sarah to reconsider her approach to managing Millicent's artistic legacy. Rather than selling works to fund the center's operations, she began exploring options for establishing an endowment that would preserve the collection while generating income for the facility's long-term sustainability. Working with Peterson and a team of specialists in art law and nonprofit management, Sarah structured the center as an educational foundation with the paintings held in trust for public benefit. Major pieces from the collection would be loaned to museums for exhibitions, generating both revenue and broader exposure for Millicent's work, while the core collection remained at the center, where it could be studied by scholars and viewed by visitors in the context of the place where it was created. The endowment structure also allowed Sarah to accept donations of other artists, work that aligned with the center's mission. Marcus Williams donated several of his photography series to the permanent collection. Carmen Delgado's mural became a permanent installation. Dr. Running Bear's sculpture garden, created using materials with deep cultural significance, became a pilgrimage site for Native American artists and scholars. As the center entered its second year of operation, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had occurred, not just in her own circumstances, but in her understanding of what inheritance could mean. The financial security provided by Millicent's paintings had rescued her from homelessness, but the deeper gift was the opportunity to continue her great-aunt's work of recognizing and preserving the dignity of overlooked people and communities. The artists who came to the center weren't just creating individual works of art. They were participating in an ongoing project of social documentation and cultural preservation that honored both artistic excellence and human compassion. Their work was exhibited in galleries and museums, but it also served communities by providing representation and validation for experiences that were often ignored by mainstream media and cultural institutions. Sarah had learned to see herself not as the owner of a valuable art collection, but as the steward of a vision that was larger than any individual could accomplish alone. The center's success depended on its ability to attract artists whose work advanced Millicent's mission, while also serving the needs of local communities and contributing to broader conversations about social justice and cultural representation. One evening, as Sarah walked through the courtyard of the restored Starlight Motel, she could hear conversations and laughter floating out of the lit studio windows. In room 3, Carmen was working with 2 local high school students on sketches for a new mural project. Room 5 was occupied by a writer-photographer team, documenting the experiences of elderly residents in small desert towns who were aging in place without family support. Room 7 housed a filmmaker creating a documentary about the environmental and health impacts of abandoned mining operations on reservation lands. The pink neon sign cast its gentle glow over the scene, and Sarah thought about the travelers who had once found refuge here during the motel's commercial heyday. Now, different kinds of travelers found shelter and support. Artists whose work required them to venture into overlooked communities and difficult subjects. Researchers whose scholarship addressed uncomfortable truths about American society. Activists whose advocacy work demanded both creative vision and emotional resilience. In the restored office, the original registration board still hung behind the desk, but instead of room keys, it now held the business cards and contact information of artists who had worked at the center, creating a network of creative professionals committed to socially engaged practice. And in the place where room 9's key had once hung empty, Sarah had mounted a small plaque with a quote from one of Millicent's letters. "Art is not about making beautiful things. It is about making sure beautiful lives are not forgotten." Room 9 itself had been converted into the center's main archive and research facility, where Millicent's correspondence, sketches, and personal effects were preserved alongside documentation of the center's ongoing programs. Scholars came to study not just the paintings, but the philosophy and methodology that had guided Millicent's work, seeking to understand how an artist working in isolation had created such a comprehensive and empathetic record of social change. Sarah often worked late in the archive, organizing materials and corresponding with researchers, museums, and other artists who were interested in Millicent's legacy. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after the studios had closed and the desert night settled around the buildings, she felt her great-aunt's presence in the space, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as a continuing influence that shaped the decisions Sarah made and the vision she maintained for the center's future. The inheritance that had seemed like a cruel joke when she was sleeping in alleyways had become the foundation for something larger than she could have imagined. Sarah Mitchell was no longer homeless. She was home, in a place where stories mattered and where the dignity of forgotten people was preserved in paint and passion, in community, and in the simple act of seeing and being seen. But more than that, she had learned that true inheritance was not just about receiving something valuable, but about accepting the responsibility to continue and expand the work that had created that value. Millicent's paintings were worth millions of dollars because they represented decades of patient attention to people and places that society had learned to overlook. The center's success came from its commitment to continuing that work, supporting new generations of artists who shared Millicent's vision of art as a form of social justice and cultural preservation. As Sarah locked the archive and prepared to return to her living quarters, Millicent's former space, which she had expanded but never fundamentally changed, she thought about the letter that had started her journey. Millicent had written about Sarah's childhood act of giving her coat to a homeless man, recognizing it as evidence of character that would guide her stewardship of a complex inheritance. Now Sarah understood that the coat had been preparation for this responsibility, that her own experience of homelessness and vulnerability had equipped her to understand what Millicent's paintings represented and why they mattered. The center's success came from Sarah's ability to recognize authentic work and authentic need, to distinguish between artists who were engaged in serious social documentation and those who might exploit marginalized communities for artistic or commercial gain. The Starlight Motel had been reborn, and with it, Sarah had found not just financial security, but the kind of wealth that could never be appraised or authenticated. The wealth of purpose, community, and the knowledge that every story, including her own, had value worth preserving. The neon sign that had once called to weary travelers now beckoned to artists and scholars, community members and visitors, all drawn by the promise that their experiences and perspectives mattered, that dignity could be found and celebrated in any circumstances, and that art, at its best, was not decoration or entertainment, but a form of witness that honored the full complexity and beauty of human life.